Hello, I'm Gene Garcia. I'm a principal engineer at Microsoft on the OEA team. And in this brief video, I'm going to walk you through the basic setup of OEA and then demonstrate some of the core features. So let's jump in. We're going to start here on the openeducationanalytics.org website. And in the upper right, click on the GitHub link. And then on the GitHub project page, if you scroll down, you'll see the What You Need section. And basically, you just need an Azure subscription, and you have to have the role assignment of owner on that subscription. And then the setup is a three-step process, starting with launching the Cloud Shell. So you can control-click on that so that it opens in a new tab, and then log in to your Azure subscription. And if it's the first time you've used Cloud Shell, you'll have to go through an additional dialogue to do some initial setup. But then you end up here where you've got a prompt, and you can go on to step 2, which is to CD into Cloud Drive and clone the repository. So we're going to CD into Cloud Drive. We'll clone the repository. And so it's bringing the contents of the repository into your Cloud Drive. And depending on your internet connection, it'll take a few seconds. And then once this is complete, we can move to step 3, which is to run the setup. And when you're running the setup, there's a very basic way of invoking it. And then there are more advanced options where you can specify the location, and you can also specify whether or not you want to have Azure Active Directory roles created. So let's see if it's done with the cloning. Okay, so now we're ready to run that setup. So let's do this. We'll invoke the setup, and we need to provide a suffix. So I'm going to use this as my suffix. This is what the setup script will use when it's naming Azure resources. I'm going to have it create resources in the West US region, and I'm going to have it use the Azure Active Directory security roles. Okay, so now it's provisioning the Azure resources for OEA, and what you can do is you can follow along here as it's creating the resources, but you can also follow along in Azure Portal. So let's do that. Let's open up another window here and go to the resource group that's being created. So let's see. Okay, so this is the resource group that's been created, and there's nothing yet that has finished provisioning. So we see now that it's on this step of creating the workspace, and this is a long step that's going to take a few minutes. Let's come back here and do a refresh and see if we see any resources. All right, so now the storage account has been provisioned. And if you go to the activity log, there's some delay, but you can come here and you can see more detailed messages about the provisioning of the various Azure resources. All right, so as soon as this is done, you'll end up with a link that allows you to get to your Synapse workspace. You'll also see the Synapse workspace in the resource group here. Here it is now. But it's still in the process of being provisioned. So we'll wait until this part, until the script says it's complete, and then we'll move on to the next section of showing some of the core features. Okay, so it's made some progress here. We can take a look at the resource group, do a refresh, see that it's created additional resources now. So we have the Application Insights resource and a Key Vault. We have this Apache Spark pool. That's part of what took so long to get provisioned. And you could also then come to the activity log and see here that you have a number of messages around the provisioning of those resources. Okay, let's see, are we complete? It's almost done. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, there we go, it finished. Okay, so when it finishes, it gives you this link to your Synapse Studio workspace. You can also, it's the same as coming to the work group, the resource group, and clicking here on Synapse Workspace and opening it up from there. So either way. Okay, so here's the workspace that the setup script has provisioned, and let's take a quick tour of the resources that are available now. The best place to start is here on the develop area, and there's a README notebook. And this README just gives you a quick overview of the different examples that you can walk through. And then there are other assets. These are the examples listed here. But then there's also the OEA framework Python code itself, which has some of the core functionality like pseudonymizing data and also ingesting batch data. And so there are other utilities we can look at in a minute. So then you have also, if you click on Manage, you have a number of linked services that have been provisioned as part of the initial setup. Normally when you create Synapse Studio from scratch, it wouldn't have these linked services. It would only have these two at the bottom as a default. But part of the OEA setup is to set up some standard linked services that can be used in pipelines. And then if you come over to Integrate, you'll see a number of pipelines that serve as good starting places for common scenarios. So let's take a look here at example main pipeline, and we'll go ahead and kick off this pipeline, trigger now. So this is the first example that's described here in the README. We're going to walk through this end-to-end discussion quickly. So that's been kicked off, and if you go to monitor, you can see the pipeline runs. So here's the one that I just kicked off. And the first thing that it does is it copies test data from the GitHub repository and lands it in your data lake. So if you click on data and expand here, you can see the structure of your data lake. So part of the OEA setup is to create this initial structure where stage one is the initial landing area of your data lake. This is where the raw data is landed and it's non-pseudonymized, so that's the NP. And then after this, the next step in the pipeline is to do the initial prep, which does pseudonymization and lands data in stage 2P for pseudonymized, and then it lands the lookup data in stage 2 NP. So let's take a look at stage 1 NP, and we'll see here the data that's been brought in. So inside of Contoso Sys, we have these representing tables of data, batch data being brought in. And we'll see here that there's a date timestamp for each time that pipeline has been run. Okay, so if we go back to the pipeline, then everything we saw there was to pull data from the source system and land it into stage one. If you wanted to see more details of how that works, you can double click on the pipeline here, and it brings up the child pipeline that's being invoked. And so that child pipeline is basically just doing a call to an HTTP endpoint and saving the CSV data that it gets from that endpoint. You can see the details of what endpoints are being invoked by looking at what's being passed in here under settings. So here's the JSON that's describing what's being called. Another way to see what it's doing too is we can go back to the monitor area. And if we let's look at one of these copy from URL, you can see here the user properties. So under user properties, it shows you what's the URL that was being invoked. You know, if I copy this, you can see the link that it's calling. So that's the data that it's landing in stage one. Okay, so let's see now if we go back to this level. So it has copied the data in, and it's still executing the pipeline itself. So if we click on that, we can see that it's completed this extract, and now it's in this phase where it's running the notebook to process that data. Okay, and now it has completed this step of ingesting into stage 2 and stage 2 NP. So if we go back to our data lake, we can see in stage 2P and 2NP and 2P, we can see now that that data is available here. So if we drill into there, what we'll find is that this is the lookup data. So for instance, student demographics, and this Delta log folder indicates that this is a data lake that is in Delta format. And so here's the Parquet file. So we see then that the data has landed in stage 2 NP and stage 2P. And then the last part of this pipeline is to create a SQL DB and create a Lake DB. So that's effectively creating a view. Let's see if it's available yet. Looks like it's not yet available. Let's go back and see in the monitor if it's completed. Okay, so it has created the SQL DB. It hasn't yet finished creating the Lake DB. So if we come back here, we'll likely need to do a refresh. Let's do a refresh and see. Okay, here we go. All right. So by doing a refresh, now we can see the SQL database that got created and the Lake database. Now, these are effectively metadata pointing to the same place in your data lake. So this metadata was created through Apache Spark, and it allows us to explore and process that data further using notebooks. And then the data here was processed using SQL Serverless. The view was created using SQL Serverless. And so we can access these tables as if it were a SQL database in any tool that knows how to connect to a SQL database. So let's pull up Power BI and demonstrate that. Okay, so we're in Power BI desktop. The first thing we want to do is get data. And the data that we're going to get it's coming from our data lake, but it's using the Azure SQL connector. So we use Azure SQL Database. And what we use here for server, if you go back over to the portal, so I'm in the resource group that was created by OEA, by the setup. And if you go into your Synapse workspace, you have this link here, the serverless SQL endpoint. Copy that, get back over into Power BI, and you can leave database blank, and we'll do import is fine. So click OK. And now you need to log in with the user that has access to those resources that you provisioned. Okay, so now we're seeing here the view created in SQL Serverless of all the data that we have. You'll notice if you expand the data, the Lake database, you won't see tables here, and that's because it's in the Delta Lake format, and so that's not yet supported through this connector. Okay, so I've selected all those. I'm going to click Load, Apply Changes. Okay, so the data has been imported, and I can see here on the right-hand side that the student attendance lookup data has the school year, the student ID, and the student ID pseudonym. And then the student attendance pseudo table has a bunch of data, including the student ID pseudonym, but not the student ID itself. And so, if a GDPR request comes in, it really only impacts this lookup table. You can delete the student from the lookup table, and there's no way to track back this attendance data to a student any longer. Okay, that's it. That's the installation and a basic walkthrough of the core features. Now you're ready to install additional modules and packages and explore additional assets. All right, thank you.